Hey there, Jess from Make and Do Crew here, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to add ribbing to the edge of any crochet project. This technique is perfect for the brim of beanies, the edges of your sweaters, and really any other time you want to give your project a nice knit look ribbing. My mom and I use this method in so many of our crochet patterns. Here it is in the Campfire Cardigan in single crochet ribbing stitches, and here it is in the Mezzo Cardigan using yarn over slip stitches. When I'm crocheting ribbing, I like to use a hook size that's one size smaller than what I used for the main body. This method always begins with a setup row in which we're working single crochet stitches into the entire span where you're going to be adding ribbing. And you want the right side of your project facing when you work that setup row. Because this swatch is reversible, I've placed this stitch marker here so that we can remember which is our right side. Because I'm right-handed, I'm going to attach my yarn over here, and I like to do that just with a slip knot on my hook, and then I just yarn over and pull it through the slip knot and then tighten it down, and then my yarn is attached. So now I'm going to chain one and then single crochet in this stitch and then each stitch across this row. So say for example you actually wanted to add ribbing right here along the raw row edges. You can do the same thing by single crocheting into this edge, and that sets up a nice clean foundation for adding your ribbing. Once that single crochet row is complete, we're going to begin a chain that works this direction, and then we're going to work our ribbing back and forth like this. And the length of the chain that you start with is going to determine how tall your ribbing is. So if you want it several inches, you're going to make a longer chain. If you just want it, say 1.5 inches, you're going to make a shorter chain. For this example, I have chained 9 stitches. So now I'm going to turn this because I'm going to work back this direction into my chains. And in this case, I'm going to use single crochet stitches, but like I said, you can use any stitch for your ribbing. Try slip stitches, yarn over slip stitches, half double crochet, single crochet. All of those work really well to create that ribbed look. In this case, because I'm working single crochet, I'm going to work into the second chain from the hook, just like we typically would with single crochet, and then I'm going to single crochet in each chain. Because I started out with 9 chains and I skipped the first one, I should end up with 8 stitches at the end of this little row. And once those stitches are complete, I've made it back to my setup row here, and this is where the magic happens, because this is how we attach our ribbing as we work it. So I am going to slip stitch into my first stitch from that setup row, and a slip stitch is just yarning over and pulling up a loop and then just pulling it straight through the loop that's on your hook. So I like to make these fairly tight. I don't want little loops protruding here. I want them to sort of recede and be invisible. So I've slip stitched one. I'm going to slip stitch another one. And this number here, the number of stitches that you slip stitch along this edge, is determined by the height of the stitch that you're using. So if you were using half double crochet, which is taller, you may slip stitch 3 each time you come back to this edge. If you were using just slip stitch ribbing, which would be shorter, you may only slip stitch 1. Another reason you may slip stitch more or fewer is how tight you want the ribbing to look compared to the body of the item. In this case, I don't want my ribbing to be much narrower than the width of my swatch. I'm just trying to basically cover the height of the single crochet row, so I'm slip stitching 2. Once that's done, I'm going to turn my work because I'm going to work back in the opposite direction here. And before we begin row 2 of the ribbing, let's get our bearings. We have the right side facing, so this is going to be a right side row, and I have 2 slip stitches from what I just worked along that setup row. So I'm going to skip both of these and work into the next stitch. If you slip stitch 3, you would just skip all of those slip stitches. We're not going to chain one at the beginning of this row though. We're just going to work directly into our first stitch, and ribbing is typically worked through the back loop of whatever type of stitch you're doing. So this doesn't matter on the first row because there's only a chain you're working into, but from the second row and beyond, we want to work through only the back loop of our stitch. So I'm going to skip those 2, and then I'm going to insert my hook under this back loop and complete a single crochet. So This is called single crochet through the back loop ribbing. And this works well with slip stitches, yarn over slip stitches, half double crochet. You can do the same technique with all of those stitches. So I am going to single crochet through the back loop of each of my single crochets until I have one remaining at the end of the row. When I have one stitch remaining here, I'm going to work it as a typical single crochet. So I'm working under both loops instead of just the back loop, and I found this creates a little bit tidier edge along the bottom of the ribbing. I've got both loops there, and I'm going to work my last single crochet. So it can be easy to accidentally miss a stitch or two as you're working back and skipping your slip stitches. So I like to count my stitches several times throughout this process just to make sure I didn't accidentally eliminate one. At the end of row 2, I'm going to chain 1. Whether you want to think of it at the end of the row or the beginning of the next row, we need to chain 1, and then we're going to work back in the opposite direction. We have a wrong side row facing now, and I am going to single crochet through the back loop of each of these stitches. So I'm going to skip that first chain just like we usually do with single crochet, and then I'm going to single crochet through the back loop of each of my 8 ribbing stitches. As I approach the end of this row, I want to point out to you where my last stitch is because it can be a little hard to see. So I have worked in this single crochet, and then my last stitch to work into is this little V right here. After that, we're going to be running into our setup row. So this is why I recommend counting your stitches, because it's kind of hard to see what's going on until you get a bit more practice, and counting them can help be your check to make sure that you've collected every stitch that you need to along the way. So now that I have 8 single crochets here, I'm going to slip stitch to my first single crochet there, and then I'm going to slip stitch once more. So this is just what we did last time on our wrong side row. Again, I'm going to flip my work. It's important here to always flip your work the same way, so I like to think of it like turning the page of a book. I'm always flipping it this direction. And again, I'm going to skip these first slip stitches here. I don't need to work into those. And then I'm going to begin without chaining 1, just directly into the back loop of these single crochet stitches. I'm almost to the end of this row, and this is another place where it's really easy to accidentally skip a stitch, but I have one more V left to work into there. So this is the one where I want to work under both loops because it's my final stitch of the row. So I've got my last single crochet, and then I'm going to chain 1 and work back in the opposite direction. So continue alternating rows like this, where you work in the back loop of each stitch until you get to your foundation row, slip stitch along that row, turn, work in the back loop of every stitch until you have one left, work under both loops of that, and you're just going to repeat that process until you've worked into all the stitches of your row. As I approach the end of my setup row here, I want to point out something you may run into, and that is that depending on the number of single crochets in your setup row, you may end up with an odd stitch here that doesn't fit your pattern of how many you've slip stitched along so far. So in this case, I have 1 stitch left, and I would work back this direction, and because I'm going to be done with my ribbing at that point, I would fasten off here, just slip stitch another stitch and fasten off. But if, for example, this was the bottom of a sweater and I wanted to continue with ribbing going this direction up around the collar, I would want to work this row, slip stitch right here, and then position my yarn back down here. So I would just work another ribbing row here. And by positioning my yarn here, I would have it ready to do another setup row, and then do the same ribbing process perpendicular to the direction I was working before. So I've worked my last row now back this direction and fastened off because I'm done with my ribbing, and I wanted to show you what it looks like on the right side now. It's really pretty and clean thanks to that setup row that we did. And you can see that this edging now works beautifully if, for example, I was going to seam this into a sleeve or it was the brim of a hat. But like I said, you can use this same technique in multiple places in a project. So for example, I could work ribbing again in this direction if this were the edge of a cardigan or the side of a towel, or really anything else that you want to add a rib edge to. If you found this helpful, I would love it if you considered subscribing, and I'll see you next time with another crochet tutorial. Thanks for watching and happy crocheting!